Okay, now before we get into actually knitting the washcloth, I've typed up this is, you really don't need a pattern for this washcloth, but I typed this up just kind of as a really basic introduction to reading knitting patterns. Because I learned how to knit from a friend when I was in high school, but I really didn't learn how to read knitting patterns until I was well into my 30s. I just felt really intimidated by it. It felt like it was all written in code. And it is, but it's really simple to decode. And I will also say, if there's ever a term you find on a knitting pattern that you don't know what that means, just get on YouTube and search that the code that you're seeing, whatever it is, and the word knitting. And chances are very, very good that you're going to come up with videos that show you exactly what that thing is. Okay, so we have our title, we have our author. Things will be listed out in different ways in different patterns, but so for here we have materials, and I wrote size US 3, and then in parentheses 3.25 millimeter needles. You'll see that written, those interchangeably. Most of the knitting patterns that I have used, if they're coming from someone who lives in Canada or somewhere in Europe, really most other parts of the world besides the United States, it'll have the millimeter size listed first, and then the US size listed next to it. The needle sizes are exactly the same. It's just helpful information for depending on how you read your knitting needle packets. Okay, so it says what needle size to use. For this, I just simply wrote a skein of dishcloth yarn. Most knitting patterns will have more detailed information. Like it might say this many grams of yarn or this much length. Often it'll give both of those measurements. And it's like a whole world trying to figure out exactly how much yarn you need, even if you buy the exact same kind they used. But typically they'll tell which specific yarn they used when they knit the sample. And that can help give you an idea of what kind of yarn to buy if you can't buy that exact same yarn or you don't want to buy that exact same yarn. Another good just beginner trick to know is if you walk into an independent knitting store, probably not like a big craft store, but like an independent local shop, yarn shop with a knitting pattern, chances are pretty good that the staff there is going to be able to help you figure out what kind of yarn you need. Okay, so we have our yarn. I didn't write it on this pattern, but on every other pattern you see, it's going to give you a gauge. And what they mean by that is this is our garter washcloth that we're going to knit. This is a very, very slightly more advanced one where I knit across the front and then purled across the back. This washcloth is exactly what it means to knit a gauge swatch. So patterns will tell you that the gauge is so many stitches, they mean across. So many stitches across and so many stitches tall, long, within a 4x4 inch square. And what that means is everyone knits differently. Some people knit really tight, some people knit really loose, and it doesn't really matter, as long as your stitches are neat, it doesn't matter so much whether you knit tight or loose because it's all relative. Sometimes I'll pull out a knitting pattern and I'll think, oh, I probably need to go up a needle size because I was too tight on the last other unrelated pattern that I knit. And then maybe I need to go down, because really whether you're tight or loose is relative to whoever wrote the pattern and how tight or loose they are. So I was surprised when I learned, when I took a sweater knitting class and learned, I knit up a gauge swatch, I counted my stitches, I counted my rows, and I was off, and I said to the instructor, so I need to knit tighter or I need to knit looser? And she said, no, You don't need to change the way you knit, you just need to change your needle size. So depending on if you're knitting tighter than what the gauge is supposed to be, like if the gauge is 20 inches or 20 stitches in 4 inches and you're getting like 30 stitches in 4 inches, you need to go up a needle size because you need more space, but you want those stitches to be a little bit bigger. Whereas if you are supposed to be getting 20 stitches in 4 inches and you're only getting 10, you want to go down a needle size so that you can fit more stitches in that same amount of space. That's like a very simplistic explanation of a kind of infuriating lifelong battle with gauge, but that's a super simple overview. But so this particular pattern does not talk about gauge because the beauty of knitting this really simple washcloth is that it doesn't matter. So my washcloth is about 6.5 inches square. If yours is about 6 inches square or about 7 inches square, it doesn't matter. The idea here is just to practice knitting. But I wanted to give a brief explanation of that because that is something that you'll encounter on other knitted patterns. So here we have our actual pattern. It says CO 35 stitches. CO is just shorthand for cast on. And that's something that we're gonna show how to do. So you'll cast on 35 stitches using a long tail cast on. That's the kind of cast on we're gonna do. Then the instructions for this feel silly because it's so simple. Any other pattern you read will be more complex and involved, but I just said knit across all 35 stitches, turn your work, continue knitting for all rows until the washcloth measures 6.5 inches in length. So what that means is that when you knit your washcloth, you're not having to count how many rows you've done. In some knitting projects you definitely do need to count how many rows. But this is a really beginner friendly project. So you're not counting rows. You're just knitting and knitting and knitting. And when you think, oh, maybe I'm close to 5 inches, you measure with a tape measure. And then I'm gonna get one out. So I have my little tape measure. Any kind of, like a regular ruler is also fine. You just want to lay your work on a flat surface and then, oh, you know what? I said 6.5 inches. Okay. So I've done 6.5 inches. Pretend my work is still on my knitting needles. I know, okay, now it's time for me to bind off. So I'm not having to count how many rows with this project. I'm just knitting at my own personal gauge until I get to the length. If you notice that your washcloth is more like 7 inches or 6 inches and you want it to be a square, then just stop whenever it's the right size to be a square. Okay, so you're gonna knit that far. And then we have BO, which does not stand for body odor. It stands for bind off. And that's something that I'm gonna show, but that's just shorthand for bind off. And then weave in ends, which I will show, and then you're finished. That's it. So this is a really simple pattern, but it's kind of a basic intro to what some of that code means. But if you didn't have the little cheat sheet of CO means cast on, you could just type into YouTube CO knitting or how to CO knitting, and it's gonna bring up lots of videos about casting on. So there will definitely be things that you will look at in a pattern and you'll think, oh, I don't know how to do that. But probably 5 minutes on YouTube and you can figure out exactly how to do what you need to do. So don't be too intimidated by patterns. They're just really great tools for helping you learn how to knit what you want to knit.